Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Learn Arena podcast. I am Trey Goff, co-founder and CEO of Learn Arena, and with me is Gabriel Mitchell. Gabriel, you want to give a brief introduction of who you are and what we do a little bit and what you do at Learn Arena, and then I'll do the same?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Gabriel Mitchell. I am, in essence, a professional philosophy nerd. My whole life has been about exploring ideas and finding ways to communicate them. So my role at Learn Arena is exactly that. I help build out the courses. I manage relationships with professors and intellectuals who want to build courses. So in some sense, I'm the head of educational content or something along those lines. Learn Arena is all about getting you the good, impactful information and helping you kind of learn what you need to learn for your own educational goals, and I'm definitely a big part of that.
That's absolutely right. Gabriel does some absolutely super high impact work at Learn Arena. He has one of the cooler jobs in the company. He's the one that gets to decide what you guys are learning, so he cannot sing Gabriel's praises highly enough. And as I mentioned, I am co-founder and CEO of Learn Arena. We started the company about a year and a half ago or so, maybe 2 years ago now, somewhere in there, and are trying to grow as quickly as possible. So to that end, let me tell you guys a little bit about what the purpose of this podcast is, what we're up to at Learn Arena, and what I hope you guys can get out of it. So Gabriel and I had the idea to start this podcast primarily because we wanted to get our educational content more out there, if you will, to expose more of you to learning, to improve your lives in as many modalities and interfaces as is possible. So this podcast will be video and audio as well. And it fits into the broader milieu of what we're trying to do at Learn Arena. Because what we're trying to do at Learn Arena, in a nutshell, is create a world where anyone can learn anything in a compelling, engaging, and even in some ways addictive way through our user interface and through our unique comparative advantages of gamification, the financial incentive and the financial reward from performing well in courses, as well as our broad variety of course content. So our mission at Learn Arena is effectively to create a new rung on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder to help anyone and everyone in the world out there learn what they need to learn to gain the skills, the knowledge, the confidence, and the expertise to build the impactful, purposeful life that they want to build for themselves. To that end, we will be covering a variety of things in the podcast. So as for format, we will have a few different types of episodes. The first type is what you're seeing us do here now, which will be a discussion of and an overview of some courses that we have on the platform. It'll give you a teaser, if you will, a taste of what it's up to. I hope that from these little overviews, you will be able to learn something about the topic at hand, but if you want more detail and more information, go sign up for the course on Learn Arena. 2, we will do some current events, kind of current culture and new research finding discussions. So in those conversations, which we will record the first one of within the next week, we will cover kind of what are the latest and greatest cultural issues, think pieces, research findings, etc., that Gabriel and I learned a lot from and want to discuss in hopes that you guys and gals will be able to learn a lot from it as well. So those will be the 2 primary episode types. We will occasionally also interview subject matter experts on a variety of topics, including course authors on Learn Arena and other subject matter experts that are covering things that we think you guys can learn from. At the end of the day, the entire purpose of this podcast, which will always be free, is to help you guys learn. Full stop. We want to provide as much value for you all as possible. So with that, let's dive right into our first discussion of one of the more interesting courses that is currently being uploaded to the platform. Again, as we mentioned earlier, our objective with Learn Arena is to, over time, eventually, have a course on literally everything, on any conceivable topic, so that you can learn anything that you are interested in that you think will benefit your life in some way. To that end, we are starting with some of the more kind of bedrock foundational things that impact many other areas of life, which is philosophy generally, and then specifically ethics. Now, when I say ethics, what might come to mind immediately is some very boring kind of thoughts about like what is right and what is wrong. Ethics and morality are often two kind of conflated topics, and it just sounds kind of boring and meaningless at the end of the day anyway. I'm sure you've been taught at some point growing up that like, oh, well, everything ethics and morality related is subjective due to the kind of postmodern takeover of modern philosophy. So you might think, why does this matter in the first place? Like, I kind of know what's right and wrong. Why would I possibly want to learn anything more about ethics? Like, why should I care?
You know, that's a good question. I think it helps to really just identify what it is we've been talking about when we're chatting about ethics and morality. And for the purpose of this course that's coming out and the purpose of the conversation you and I are about to have, ethics and morality we're just going to use interchangeably. There are some specific academic fields where there is a distinction. Sometimes ethics is closer to kind of like business ethics is closer to like manners almost, you know. But for the context of this, we're going to use ethics and morality in the same sense. And so it's just a matter of like, what does that even mean? Like, what are we even talking about? You can kind of think of it as like the rules of your behavior or the value judgments that you make about the choices that you and other people make. And if you really think hard about the question of what does it mean to be a human being and live your best life and just live life in general, you're making choices all the time. Who you love, who you work for, whether or not you're going to take, when you find a wallet on the street, whether or not you're going to take the money out of it or something. And those decisions have impacts. They change your relationships with people. They change your level of happiness. They change the level of health. And so it's quite obvious that the choices we make on the day-to-day matter a lot. And so ethics or morality is really just the science or the area of study of trying to pinpoint how to think about those choices and what sort of values we should be weighing those choices against. Do we care about maximizing our self-interest, or do we care about maximizing other people's interests? Do we care about following some sort of set of objective rules or something else? And so that's really what it's all about. And if you just, it's almost intuitively obvious that this is something worth studying, right? It's almost like intrinsically sort of self-motivating. Because what would it mean for it to not be worthwhile to study? Well, if you claim that it's not worthwhile to study, then you're actually making an ethical claim, right? You're sort of self-refuting by rejecting ethics, and so you must necessarily study it or at least pay a little bit of attention.
That's a fantastic answer, Gabriel. I appreciate that. Now, let me, before we dive into kind of what we'll cover in the Learn Arena course, let me give you a challenge that I have heard many times as it relates to discussions of ethics. And you'll see this in the popular sentiment on, say, places like Twitter, or X now, excuse me. Something along the lines of, all right, that's all well and good, Gabriel. We need to figure out by what framework we make decisions about how to interact with other human beings and what we deem good and bad behavior. But society's been around for a long time. You know, advanced, like human civilization has been around for at least 10,000 years. Surely we've kind of figured that out by now, right? Surely like we know the answer. How is this still a debated topic? How is this still something worth studying versus just saying, look, here's the rules, everybody should follow those?
I think that's a fun question because I've noticed that like this is a challenge I think to philosophy in general, and especially philosophy that has to do with other people, so ethics and politics. Because if you and I disagreed about, let's say, a scientific fact about what the gravitational constant is, right? It probably wouldn't be a heated debate. And like we'd probably be willing to admit areas of ignorance. But for some reason, when it comes to questions of ethics or politics, people are really aggressively confident in their position, even if they've never once read a book on the topic, even if they've never once done any sort of studying. And I've always found that very curious. And I think part of the problem is that it gives the illusion of being a very easy thing. And because it's so personal, right? Ethics is about how you act, and politics is about how the world interacts with you and your friends and your family and your neighborhood. I think because of that, because it's both an illusion of being easy and very personal, it unfortunately motivates a level of confidence that I think is not totally justified. And so I guess what I would respond to someone who feels as if there's no point in debating this, we've already kind of figured it out, just follow society, I would just ask them why. Why is probably the most important foundational philosophical question for all things, right? And the moment you start to think about, like, okay, well, do I agree with the social standards around me? Do I agree with every single law that I'm subject to? Do I agree with the moral standards of my parents? Once you start to ask those questions, now you're doing philosophy, now you're doing ethics, and now you've proven that it's worth thinking about. And so the choice really is either, are you going to be unconscious or conscious? And being unconscious is just one step away from being dead. And so if you care about being alive and being a flourishing human being and being more than just a couch potato, you should probably be thinking about ethics and thinking about whether or not you do actually agree with the social standards that are in front of you.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. I could not have said that any better myself. Fantastic. Thank you. Now let me present one more challenge to the study of ethics here before we dive into your course. A lot of public commentary about ethics broadly seems to presume it is inherently a subjective field. So let me define two philosophical terms very briefly for everybody. You have subjectivity and then positivity. Subjectivity, or normativity is another way that is often phrased, refers to something that is not externally validatable. It is not a statement of explicit fact like the sky is blue. So the sky is blue would be a positive statement, versus I don't like the color of the sky right now is a normative statement or a subjective statement, right? So a lot of public commentary around ethics seems to implicitly assume, and sometimes this is stated explicitly, everyone has their own personal ethics. Everyone has their own subjective truth, which is a whole other rabbit hole I don't want to go down, but it's usually paired with this, so bracket that for now, because Gabriel and I would both vehemently challenge that. But everyone has their own subjective truth, and therefore everyone also has their own subjective ethics, Nothing is really concrete, established out there. There's not like a set of facts we can observe about the universe and use that to deduce laws like physics, right? There is no gravitational constant, to use your example, of ethics that we have externally, independently validated with instrumentation and measurement and mathematics, right? So why should I worry with studying what other people have said about ethics if ethics is inherently personal and subjective anyway, and I just kind of have to – it's up to each individual person, and that there is no right or wrong ethic. It's just completely and inherently subjective and arbitrary, and therefore it's not really worth studying what other people say because I should just figure it out myself.
One of the things that I think makes my ethics course a little bit different than an ethics course you might stumble upon in like a community college or any general university is the first thing we deal with in the course is the question of subjective versus objective, as well as other terms like relative and intrinsic. Though I don't use terms like positive or normative, like you said. I think those are powerful terms. But they tend to be a little bit more useful in the context of, say, an economics course, which you yourself have built. And because I think that a lot of people have this impulse, or at least have this, or even if they believe morality is objective and that there is some sort of universal set of rules or something, it's often an unquestioned assumption. And it's true of a lot of people's philosophical beliefs, is that they're very much unquestioned and unexamined. The unexamined life is not worth living. Very powerful quote. It goes as far back as the early days of philosophy, so I think it's very, very true that all of us have certain beliefs that are unexamined and unquestioned. And unfortunately, sometimes those beliefs are really important beliefs. Like the question of, is morality subjective? Is it just this personal thing and I can do whatever I want? Versus, is morality about a set of objective rules or some sort of objective standard? It's a very important question, because if you're the type of person who is motivated by truth, and if you reach the truth that morality is subjective, or if you reach the truth that morality is objective, that will change how you act. So it's a very, very important question. And unfortunately, I just think it's often an unquestioned assumption. And so the most important thing to ask yourself is, well, why do I believe this? Why do I believe this? Why do I believe this? And of course, the course isn't about what I think about morality, or about ethics, morality. It's about just what these terms mean, how to use them, and it gives you the tools and vocabulary as well as references to thinkers and quotes to help you figure that out. So if you're coming into it with the assumption of morality is objective or morality is subjective or something else, I think the course will challenge you to really start to question your assumptions and talk about the different historical debates that have dealt with that. I personally, and I think it's important that we're very open about what we believe. I personally am a firm believer that morality is not a matter of subjectivity, that there is a such thing as an objective morality, that that sort of objective standard can be universalized. The specifics of that, for me, may be different than what other people believe in objective morality. Some people are utilitarian, some people are virtue ethics, so on and so forth. And I think it's a really important question, and that's why it's essentially one of the very first things I try to tackle in the course is, what does objective actually mean? What does subjective actually mean? What does relative mean? What does intrinsic mean? And what would it mean for a moral claim to be subjective versus objective? As well as, in general, what do other sort of sentences mean? Like if I say, what's a movie you've seen recently? Barbie. I saw the Barbie movie recently. Cool. So if I said the Barbie movie is 5 minutes long, okay, obviously a false claim. We know that it's like an hour and a half or something like that. It would seem I'm making a claim about an object. In this case, the object is the movie, okay? Something is uniquely different than if I were to say, I found the Barbie movie funny, or even if I said the Barbie movie is funny. You'll notice that something about these two claims are very different. And this is what the objective-subjective distinction is trying to get at. And there's some nuances and a lot of historical debate here that is tackled in the course. But something about me saying this movie is 5 minutes long versus this movie is funny, they seem to be uniquely different. One of them is about me describing the characteristics of an external object, while the other one seems to be describing my subjective experience of that external object. Right? And so the funny interpretation is usually what we describe as subjective, while the other one is usually what we describe objective. And this is just a quick preview of the basic ideas. It's there's a bit more of a deeper dive in there. But a lot of people just have this unquestioned assumption that morality must be subjective or even that it must be objective. And I think this course will give you an opportunity to really question those assumptions and examine yourself. Because what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? And that's why we study philosophy, is because we know that we are human beings who are imperfect, who make errors, and it's important that for the same reason we study anything else, we should also examine our assumptions and our biases and our beliefs.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I'll just add on to that in a more kind of applied, tactical manner, if you will. When you hear, oh, there's a philosophy course on ethics, my first thought, and a lot of people's first thought might be like, oh, that's really pie in the sky, academic kind of intellectual exercise that doesn't really impact my day-to-day life that much. But I want to push back strongly on that notion, and I want to make the claim that this is actually one of the most important intellectual and academic things you can pursue, precisely because it impacts your day-to-day life so much. Everything from, let's imagine you're trying to make a decision, right? There's an employee at your company, say you're a manager, there's an employee at your company who you suspect has been stealing company time, stealing company property, whatever, committing some sort of violation of an ethic. Well, look at that. You've just implicitly assumed that they are violating an ethic. And furthermore, how you handle that violation is directly influenced by whatever ethical code, what you believe about ethics, right? Or to take an even simpler example, someone cuts you off in traffic, right? And it really frustrates you and annoys you. How you respond to that and what you believe is a right or wrong response to that is hugely impacted by what you believe from your study of ethics. And to Gabriel's point, most people, Gabriel and I often kind of jokingly use the NPC meme, right? Like most people are non-player characters insofar as they're not thinking about this at all. They're just having an emotional reaction and going with that emotional reaction without any thought as to if that emotional reaction and what action they took as a consequence is right or wrong. And this also influences, besides just stuff in your personal life, it also influences how you think about the world and how you act in the world. Ethics is at its root really the thing up for discussion when we talk about criminal justice. Even basic questions like, is justice more focused on retribution? Is it focused on restitution? Is it focused on something else? These are all questions of ethics at the end of the day, and what ethical policy we as a culture want to institute to stop bad actors and to ensure that justice is in fact done. And in fact, going a step further, even valuing justice in and of itself is an ethical claim. So I just want to point out that, like, you may be thinking, oh, this is really pie in the sky, but it's not. It's very grounded in things we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, yeah.
So with that being said, Gabriel, and you can feel free to respond to that if you want, and also as with your response, I'd love for you to do, if you don't mind, kind of a brief, walk us through an outline or a chapter guide, if you will, of what we can expect to find in the ethics course.
Yeah. So whenever anyone's talking about, like, oh, what's the point of this philosophy stuff, whether it's morality or other aspects of philosophy, I think a lot about the philosopher Ayn Rand. It's no secret that I'm a big fan of her work. She wrote a book called Philosophy Who Needs It, as well as there's a lecture that she did by the same title. And the lecture offers a example of, imagine you're a space traveler, some sort of astronaut, and you crash land on a planet. You crash land on the planet, you need to look at your instruments and figure out kind of where you are and what's going on. And essentially you have to ask a few questions. You have to figure out, okay, where am I? How do I know that? And what do I do? All three of these are the fundamental philosophical questions. Where am I? Metaphysics. What is the nature of the reality around me? How do I know that? Epistemology. And then finally, what do I do? That's ethics, right? So even if you didn't live in society, even if there was no law, even if you stranded somewhere, the question of what do I do next? What should I do? What ought I do? That is ethics. And it's so important in every context, every decision you make. And it doesn't mean that you have to paralyze yourself with decision-making paralysis and decide, oh, every decision I make is so important that I don't know if I'm going to pick the red pen or the blue pen. But you should think about your actions. And so hopefully my morality course will give someone the context necessary to start thinking about those questions for their own life, and especially thinking about the application of those questions. So my course is broken into 3 primary sections. There's first the introduction, why ethics matters, how to think about logic. Next is what's called metaethics. This is why I think my course is a little bit better than some other courses you may take, is that most people are familiar with normative ethics, which is in the 3rd section. So normative ethics is like egoism versus virtue ethics, consequentialism versus deontological. And this is great, very important topic, that's why it's in the course. But most of the time when you take an ethics course in a college setting, that's the first thing you learn. But metaethics, which is more fundamental and shows up earlier in my course, is the question of how do we even define these words in the first place? So one way to think of metaethics is like the grammar of moral language, basically. Like, what does it mean for something to be good, bad? How do we know if that claim is an objective claim or subjective claim? How do we even know if it's a claim versus something else, like an emotional expression? That's kind of what metaethics is dealing with, and it's much more foundational, and it helps clear up a lot of confusion that people have. A lot of very smart, but kind of rebellious contrarian people will get into their first morality course, and they'll learn about normative ethics and all this stuff, and their first thought is, oh, all this is subjective, none of this is real. But they don't have the foundation for making that argument. And metaethics is what gives you that foundation for thinking about, okay, how do we even know any of these claims are true in the first place? Now, a philosopher can have a certain metaethical position, say they believe in objective morality, while disagreeing with other philosophers about normative ethics. So you and I, actually, perfect example here, you and I both agree that morality is objective to some degree, but the specific application of what that looks like is slightly different. I'm more kind of in that virtue ethics egoism camp. You're kind of more in that consequentialist utilitarian camp.
That's correct. And let me pause you there for a second, Gabriel. I think this is extremely important to flesh out why these foundational things are so important. Gabriel and I have a shared context because we both agree that there is an objective morality. There is a correct morality, if you will. Yeah. But if we didn't agree there, any discussion he and I might have about a particular ethical claim, like let's take the ethical claim, for example, that defending using physical violence and self-defense against property crimes like theft or break-ins, etc., is just. That's an ethical claim, right? Well, if Gabriel and I do not agree initially that objective morality exists, then any discussion we're going to have about the object level claim, this particular ethical claim that self-defense, violence in the form of self-defense is an ethical good, we can't have the discussion, really. Because any debate we're having over it, because it doesn't have a shared foundation, we're effectively talking past each other. And we see this happen all the time in public. So I just want to highlight, it sounds really boring to discuss the definition of vocabulary terms effectively, but it is critically important to actually be able to evaluate ethical claims at all. Because, for example, if Gabriel and I don't agree on objective morality, then Gabriel might say, well, of course that's just. And I might say, well, no, it's not, because I don't feel like it is. And the conversation is dead, effectively, because we don't have that shared foundational understanding. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of the foundational meta-ethical claims to being able, irrespective of your normative ethics, you cannot evaluate a specific ethical claim unless you have taken a position in meta-ethics.
Yes, oh yeah, absolutely. And sprinkled throughout the course is examples of what we call applied ethics. So this is thought experiments, law, business ethics, government policy. All these things are what we refer to as applied ethics. And so the course deals with an introduction, deals with meta-ethics, deals with normative ethics, and sprinkled throughout that is examples of applied ethics. So you know that this isn't just in the weeds academic talk, but real life things that matter to your day-to-day decisions and the things you have control over.
Fantastic. That's exactly right. This will affect how you make decisions on a day-to-day basis. So with that being said, so we cover subjectivity, we cover meta-ethics. Do you want to give a brief survey, if you will, of some of the normative ethical fields we cover in the course as well?
Sure, yeah. So as mentioned, normative ethics is dealing with specific systems of ethics. Once we've asked these questions like, is it subjective, is it objective, whatever, then we ask, what is the specific system? So there's a handful that's talked about in the course, and of course there's theoretically almost infinite systems of morality you could have, because I could present to you as one system, and then you're like, all right, I'm going to make this slight adjustment. But a lot of them can fit into three major categories. The first one is thinking about ethics through the lens of consequences. This is what we call consequentialism. An example would be utilitarianism that tries to maximize everyone's happiness. Also, egoism can be a type of consequentialism. You're just trying to maximize your outcomes. You can either think about it, so you think about it through the lens of consequences. You can also think about it through the lens of like duties and rules and laws. Usually this is referred to as deontological ethics. Kant is probably the most historical and most famous historical example of this. So this is things like, it is always wrong to steal, regardless of the consequence, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the tensions. That would be sort of a deontological approach. Most religions kind of have this like Ten Commandments style of moral thinking. But then there's also what's called character-based ethics, also known as virtue ethics. So this is where we think about morality through the lens of what were your motivations, what were your intentions, what sort of characteristics were you embodying when you were making the decision. Aristotle is a great example of a philosopher who did this. Stoicism is a virtue ethics. We have a great course on Stoicism that's like hyper-focused on how the Stoics thought about virtue, as well as some of the other implications of their worldview. And so those are some of the major ones. Now, as mentioned, there's all sorts of nuances and ways you can combine it, right? Like natural rights is something we usually associate with deontological type thinking, but almost all the other moral forms could have a justification for rights. A consequentialist could think through like, well, maybe we should have rights because as a general rule for society, these have good outcomes, It's probably a good thing if we all agree that killing each other is the wrong thing to do. And so let's just invent a right against murder or something. And a virtue ethicist might also think about rights. They might believe in the virtue of justice. Well, justice usually includes questions about rights and who owns what and what do they deserve. But you can also combine all these moral theories into what's sometimes called moral pluralism, or sometimes there's kind of overlaps between them. And so the course deals with these fundamental categories. It deals with some examples of branches of moral thought within those categories, as well as a bunch of critiques of each one. Each section explains and then is followed up by a section of critique so that you can have a fuller vision and think harder about what you believe and what you care about.
That's fantastic. And I just want to highlight how this is different from most courses on this. So I took an ethics course in college, of course, and these things are often presented as like, here is the menu of options, and then here is the one that is probably most correct. We very intentionally are not doing that. To Gabriel's point, we are highlighting the ups and downs, the benefits and kind of negative aspects or illogical aspects of each one of these so that you can make the decision. The point here is not that we want to tell you what to believe, far from it. What we want to do is arm you with the requisite knowledge and the mental models and concepts that you need to make the decision for yourself of what you think is true, because that is the fundamental underlying thing that we're getting at here. What do you think is true as it relates to the field of ethics more broadly? So, Gabriel, I think what might be a little fun here as we close this discussion, now that we've given an overview of the course. And again, I want to highlight, if you want to learn in great detail about all of this, then go sign up for Learn Arena. This ethics course will be up and ready for you guys to take within the next 2 weeks. So it'll be there by the time, probably by the time this episode is posted on YouTube and Apple Podcasts, etc. So let's do this, Gabriel. Just as an example, and let's kind of be conscious about walking through this. Let's, as an example, take an ethical claim that you and I genuinely might disagree on and discuss it from this philosophical perspective so people can see why these ethical systems matter, okay? So I'm going to take one that I think is a perfect example of this. I, as an ethical claim, think that it might be useful if a society with political institutions properly structured would implement a universal basic income, okay? Let me lay out the claim for this. And again, I'm going to phrase this in the terms of ethics so that we can use it as a debate topic here just for 5 or 10 minutes as we close, more as an example for everyone of why this is important to discuss, right? And why this is important to learn. So I approach things from a very consequentialist perspective, as Gabriel said. At the end of the day, I have this kind of underlying belief that Gabriel and I can do a debate episode on entirely, that all ethical systems eventually devolve down to some form of consequentialism. It's kind of the bedrock of how we decide these things in my mind. So I just take that approach kind of up front, right? Now, this is tempered by, I'm a bit of a moral pluralist, as Gabriel mentioned. This is tempered by a deep respect for rights, property rights, individual rights, etc. I think the synthesis of these two things is probably the closest we're going to get to a ethical system that maximizes human flourishing, which is my goal, because again, I'm a consequentialist. I'm trying to maximize human flourishing and the flourishing of conscious beings broadly. So I think if you were to have, here's my claim that I want to kind of lay on the ground and let you attack, Gabriel. If, just to avoid a political debate, if you had a political system that was structured such that it was an ethical, just political system, okay, then within that political system, it would make sense for the government revenue, tax dollars, whatever form of revenue that government may take in, to be redistributed as a universal basic income to anyone and everyone in the society to encourage entrepreneurship and to alleviate human suffering that could otherwise be, that could fairly easily be alleviated with a properly structured, properly implemented universal basic income. And forgive me, let me define universal basic income. It's a very simple concept, which is we should take tax dollars from the government coffers and redistribute it across society, irrespective of income level, wealth, race, ethnicity, etc., such that there is effectively a floor below which no one will ever fall, no matter what. There's been some interesting empirical research on this recently that showed some micro-scale pilots. There was one in Seattle. There have been some in Norway and Sweden as well that found that this decreased poverty rates, as you might expect. It decreased rates of homelessness and hunger. It also, surprisingly, increased entrepreneurship rates, especially for very small and micro-scale businesses, because these people felt they had the flexibility to take that risk now. So I think on net, the benefit of a UBI would be positive for society. Now, let me just flag, by the way, for you guys. Every claim I just made is predicated on consequentialism, external evidence. I'm referencing peer-reviewed research. I'm referencing purely the outcomes of doing this, right? So this is an example of how I apply this consequentialism to trying to decide big political things where it's important for all of us to, everybody that's engaged in the political process, to think very diligently and rationally about these things, right? So I think a properly structured UBI with a just government from a consequentialist perspective would be a net good for society. So that's the claim I want to stake, and then have at it, Gabriel. And I'll just encourage you to do exactly what I did, which is kind of highlight as you're walking through it. This is how I'm applying my ethical framework.
Yeah, and I think one strength of your approach is it's very scientific, right? You're asking questions of what does the data say, and I'm going to align my moral convictions with the data. Which is important. Obviously, anyone who wants to have a true, just society should care about how policy has its outcomes. However, I myself, while some of my beliefs have some consequentialist impulses, for example, I am an egoist, which is someone who tries to maximize self-interest. Of course, egoism doesn't advocate for foolhardy self-destruction, right? I mean true, genuine joy and flourishing for myself. But I'm also what's called a virtue ethicist. So I care about character, and I care about embodying certain virtues and values as I'm trying to maximize that self-interest. And one of the most important virtues, almost universally agreed by virtue ethicists throughout history, is the virtue of justice. And while I can understand that there may be what we would call positive outcomes from things like UBI, I do have some concerns, particularly from the perspective of justice, right? So one thing that I am a firm believer of is that government spending and government taxation is only just if it's ever only if it comes from a sort of voluntary interaction, right? And so I believe that individuals have a right to their body and a right to their property, and a respect for justice includes the autonomy to decide what happens to your money and your property, your money, your body. And I would be concerned about creating a context where we violated that right and almost created a context where people feel as if they have a right to other people's money, you know? For the same reason, like, I don't have a right to enslave you to work for me. Taking the extra layer of, well, you're going to work, but I'm going to take the money, is very, very similar, you know? That's why some people make the claim that taxation is slavery, the specific language there might be a little bit nuanced and complicated, but for the same reason that I can't compel you to go chop down this tree for me, I can't also have you go chop down the tree and then compel you to give me the money. You know, that feels, the impulse that I have and the logic that I've sort of explored feels as if we have some sort of violation. Now, on a just personal impulse, if someone presented me a society that has a complicated, disorganized welfare state like the United States has, versus getting rid of all that and just doing UBI, that's probably an improvement. A lot of issues with welfare at its current state is that there's all these dysfunctional disincentives that lead to things where people are stuck on the welfare. You know, you may be familiar with like the welfare cliffs, right? Where
I was about to bring that up.
Exactly, right? You have a certain amount of welfare, and then you earn extra income, and now all of a sudden all of your welfare is cut, or a significant portion of it, disproportionately, where you end up with less money overall. And so something like UBI, or what Milton Friedman referred to as a negative tax credit, or negative income tax, where it just eases you out of it, is definitely an improvement. But I'm concerned about that justice. I'm concerned about the question of property rights. I'm concerned about that. And I'm also concerned about the long-term impact of people's flourishing and mental health in a context where they're being taken care of, essentially. A very important part of being a flourishing, virtuous human being is autonomy and productivity, and being someone who can care for themselves. Now, there's edge cases of people who have disabilities and things like that, or mental illnesses, and those are challenging cases. I recognize that. But for most people, most of the time, it's so important to be earning your own dollar, to a point where I think a truly, genuinely healthy human being should have at least a little bit of an ick towards receiving UBI. You know, and I'm not going to fault someone if it's there and they take it, but I think a healthy human being should have at least a little bit of an ick.
I completely agree. So I just want to highlight, before I pursue a different line of reasoning here, I want to highlight how Gabriel's claims there fall under, and you'll see how this happens a lot with people who think about ethics a lot, a similar kind of moral pluralist framework that I have, insofar as many of his points were related to virtue ethics and the concept of justice. But many of his points, especially those latter points, were also just purely consequentialist in nature. Like the results, the consequences of this action would end up being net bad for human flourishing. What Gabriel's referring to there, if any of you guys want to research it more, is the dignity argument against welfare broadly and against UBI specifically. And I find it quite compelling as well. I think there is a loss of human dignity there. It just depends on, again, this is an ethical question. Do you value human dignity or not? And to what extent do you value it relative to other values that you might also hold dear? So let me propose to you because I don't disagree with anything you said. So let me propose to you a thought experiment, okay? Because let me just also bracket here. This will go out in the codex today. So if you receive the codex, you'll see this. But there was a recent paper that found that did an extensive study of what if the United States did away with welfare and applied UBI. It was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research last week, and they found overwhelmingly it was very negative. You just get straight welfare losses across the board. Turns out, as messy as the U.S. welfare system is, it's pretty good at getting money to the people that actually need it and not getting it to people that don't need it. So just as an empirical note for those that are curious about some of the empirical claims we're making here, at least the current state of the evidence, which can evolve over time, suggests a straight switch from welfare state to UBI for the United States specifically, this might not generalize to other countries, would be a huge net negative for the very people it is trying to help. So this is an important note. Let me pose to you a hypothetical, a thought experiment. So first, for the audience, thought experiments are the most useful tool in philosophy, in my opinion. What you do is, with a thought experiment, at a meta level, you set up an example of something that could happen that isolates one of the philosophical variables you're debating, right? So it gives you the tool to extract away some of the complexity that can make it hard to think about these issues and let you focus on just one very small part of the issue. So let me propose to you a thought experiment, Gabriel. And this isn't even a thought experiment in so much as like this is how my previous company, Prospera, has set up their jurisdiction. Imagine you have a jurisdiction, and Prospera works this way, where entrance into the jurisdiction and consent to the governing entity is expressly and explicitly voluntary consent. So coming into Prospera right now, today, this isn't even a thought experiment, you literally have to sign what we call an agreement of coexistence. which explicitly states, I agree to abide by the rules and laws as they are written right now, and I agree with and consent to the mechanisms by which those laws are promulgated and future laws will be promulgated, and I reserve my right at any time to voluntarily leave the jurisdiction if I come to disagree with those things. And you sign your name on the dotted line quite literally. So let's imagine you have a jurisdiction that functions this way. Let's imagine further that that jurisdiction, because it's a completely voluntary jurisdiction, their taxes are really a fee for the service of governance, right? So don't call it taxes. It is a fee that you are paying to the government, that you consented to, the governing entity. It's not a government, but a governing service provider, to have them institute the institutional environment, meaning the rules of the game, the laws, rules, and regulations that allow you and all of your compatriots therein to flourish, right? It's for things like making sure that the legal registry is set up properly, the property registry is set up properly, that contracts are enforced, that there's a dispute resolution mechanism, that there's public safety, etc. So imagine in that environment a flourishing jurisdiction that's completely voluntary like this were to be created, and that jurisdiction was quite profitable on top of that. So now I'm switching to full thought experiment mode here. Imagine Prospera is abundantly profitable, and Prospera decides it's going to implement with the profits from this governing service provision a UBI. Does that have any impact on your justice-related argument? Setting aside the dignity argument and the consequentialist argument, which I have no argument with, and I think you could be right. That's an empirical question we don't know the answer to yet. So I'm just setting it aside. You could very well be right there. I'm going to grant you that point. I'm going to focus just on the justice claim here for a second. Does that help alleviate, from a virtue ethics perspective, your concerns about the justice of such a proposal?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I'm not approaching this from this sort of deontological approach where I have some sort of magical rule that says UBI is always wrong, and it doesn't matter how it's done. Right? That's not how I'm approaching it. I'm approaching it from this question of justice. And one of the considerations, not the only consideration, but one of the considerations is rights. And the best thing you can do for respecting human rights in most worldviews is creating context where people interact voluntarily. And if we can have a system where people are voluntarily participating in a system of UBI or any other system, then I have less ethical objections, at least from the lens of justice. There may be other things I'm concerned about, just as for the same reason, like I have friends that are dating. The dating may be voluntary, but that doesn't mean the relationship's good, right? Just because it's voluntary doesn't inherently mean it's good, but it does resolve the question of justice. And so, absolutely. And it's important to remember that, as I mentioned, this is distinct from, say, a deontological approach where I have some sort of set of rules, okay? Now, some deontological approaches might exclusively be limited to this sort of justice and rights and voluntary interaction that I'm talking about, but some of them aren't. Some of them would say things like UBI is always wrong or something like that, or receiving charity is always wrong or something like that. But that's not what I'm approaching it from. I'm approaching it from this virtue ethics understanding of justice, and part of that justice is a question of rights, and the best way to respect rights is from a lens of voluntary interaction. And so I personally, at least from the justice lens, would have no objection to that type of system.
Got it. That makes perfect sense and was exactly what I was looking for. And note there, and thank you for highlighting this, I was going to ask you to highlight how the answer to that might be different depending on different, even virtue ethicist approaches and deontological approaches to the ethics of the question of justice. So with that, I think we will call it here. I hope you have gotten something of value and learned a little bit about ethics from this discussion here. I highly encourage all of you to go subscribe to Learn Arena, sign up, and go take the ethics course if you want to learn more in detail about this. As I mentioned, moving forward, we'll do episodes like this. We will do current events and current discussion and current kind of technological progress discussions, and those will, some of which will be lively debates. I forgot to mention this earlier, but Gabriel and I will occasionally also do probably a little shorter episodes, like 20 to 30 minutes, some of which we will pick a particular topic we want to debate, just for you guys' edification, so you can hear both sides of something that Gabriel and I might disagree on. And here at a meta level, and this is another important thing I just want to leave you guys with as a preview of coming attractions, it will also help you learn kind of how to learn and how to debate and have a rational discussion about something you disagree with without it devolving into name calling, without emotions getting in the way, and in a way where both parties are acting in good faith, seeking the truth at the end of the day, as we've just done here. So like as a micro example of that, right? Gabriel made a great point about human dignity and the consequences of UBI, and I immediately granted that point because it is a fantastic point that I perhaps individually and subjectively have been wrongly underweighting, right? And I think that could be a big negative of having a universal UBI. So just as a small example. So we've got a lot more fun content coming for you guys. Please stay tuned. And the last thing I will ask is go follow us on social media, join our Discord community. Gabriel and I are very active there. Come let us know what you think of this post, and let us know what you think of this episode and things you might want us to cover moving forward. We will be paying close attention to the Discord community. So if you want to have a say in what we talk about moving forward, who we interview, what we talk about, what we debate, then please come let us know in the Discord.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to doing more.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to everybody soon.